What happened to Albania?
Today, Albania is often seen as a paradise perfect for a vacation, but very few people are aware about horrible things that took place in this country not that long ago. For more than 3 decades, Albania was the most closed-off country in Europe. Behind the calm landscape hid a system of paranoia that kept the entire nation in fear for 40 years. It was a dictatorship that completely isolated Albania and prevented its development for decades to come. The regime of Enver Hoxha was characterized by a strong cult of personality. Although on the surface, Albania looks much better now, the consequences of that system can still be seen in society. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the moment when the state suffered 2 occupations during World War II. In 1939, Albania was occupied by Italy without any serious resistance. After Mussolini's fall, power was taken over by the Germans. 5 years of occupation left the country in deep destabilization. The country was left with destroyed infrastructure and virtually no functioning authorities. It was into this chaos that Enver Hoxha stepped in, the man who would dominate Albania for the next 4 decades. He didn't particularly stand out in terms of experience or authority. He was just really effective when it came down to ruthless elimination of any rival. As the German troops left the Balkans, competing factions were trying to seize control of the country, but Hoxha's partisans systematically eliminated their opponents. In a short time, no one remained who could challenge him. That was when the foundation of the new system was born. The conviction that Albania would only survive if it was absolutely self-reliant and as isolated as possible from the rest of the world. While Europe was rebuilding its economies and forming the first structures of international cooperation, Albania went in exactly the opposite direction. It was closing its borders and eventually cutting itself off, even from its own allies. Hoxha understood that fear is the cheapest and most effective form of control, and it was on fear that he built a state that for the next 40 years would live in the belief that every contact with the outside world was a threat. Once Hoxha consolidated his power, Albania did not become just another communist state. It became an ideological project that grew not out of economics or even politics, but out of paranoid fear of anything foreign. For some time, Albania remained one of the most loyal allies of the Soviet Union. Hoxha was deeply obsessed with Stalin and idolized him. Following his model, he introduced a centrally planned economy and brutal purges. However, when Khrushchev began warming relations with the Western world in the late 1950s, Hoxha completely lost faith in the Soviet Union. Albania cut itself off from Moscow. As a result, there was only one significant ally left: China under the rule of Mao Zedong. For a while, it seemed that the alliance of 2 extremely isolated regimes could last. But when China in the 1970s began gingerly opening to the world, Hoxha again saw this as an attack on the purity of socialism, and then he made the decision that sealed the fate of the entire country. Albania would stand alone, with no allies whatsoever. That was the state's official policy. A country of 3 million people announced that it would survive with no one's help, because the entire world, capitalists and communists alike, were supposedly plotting its destruction. Everyone became an enemy. In Albanian schools, children were taught that Albania was the only true stronghold of socialism, and that the rest of the world was unfaithful and just bad in general.
Republika Popullore e Shqipërisë është bërë një faktor paqe dhe përparimi në zonën e Ballkanit dhe të Adriatikut. Pasqyre gjale e përsisë së sistemit socialist mbi atë kapitalist. Pengesë e sigurt për planet agresive të imperializmit amerikan në këtë pjesë të botës. Armiqtë e partisë dhe popullit tonë, imperialistët dhe revizionistët, na kanë halë në sy dhe na urrejnë. Ata kanë halë në sy pozitën strategjike të vendit tonë dhe pasuritë e tij të mëdha. Ata tërbohen kur shohin se brenda në prapavijat e tyre, një vend i vogël dhe një popull heroik lufton me heroizëm dhe me këmbëngulje për të mbrojtur lirinë në pavarësinë e tij dhe ndërton me sukses socializmin.
Every aspect of life, from factory work to conversations at the dinner table, was subordinated to one overriding idea that Western culture and Western ideas were an existential threat. Listening to Italian radio could get you thrown in jail. Owning a foreign book meant a labor camp. And even things like painting in a style that was too modern could lead to accusations of Western decadence. And out of this paranoia was born one of the most absurd projects in Europe's modern history. Hoxha's paranoia did not end with words or slogans. In Albania, fear had a shape and a material. To be precise, that fear was built with concrete. From the 1970s onward, Albania launched a program to build over 170,000 concrete bunkers. Hoxha took an idea that might remind us of Swiss civil defense shelters. But unlike the sturdy, well-designed Swiss bunkers, those made in Albania were cheap and hastily constructed. They were never really intended to protect the population in case of invasion. Their true purpose was to keep the entire country in a permanent state of fear. Those bunkers stood not only along the borders, but all over the country. Hoxha wanted people to believe that Albania could be attacked at any moment. Maybe by NATO, by Greece, or maybe even by its former allies from the Eastern Bloc. And since everyone was an enemy, the entire country was to be turned into a fortress. But it was made in a way that defies logic. Bunkers on beaches, bunkers by rivers, bunkers in the mountains, bunkers next to schools. They were thrown together so hastily and cheaply that they would have been pretty useless in a real military conflict. But when it came to keeping the population in a constant state of fear and paranoia, they worked perfectly. The bunker was meant to be a constant reminder that danger was everywhere, and that only the authorities could protect you. Pouring concrete for 170,000 bunkers placed an enormous strain on Albania's already struggling economy. At its peak, the program devoured as much as 10% of Albania's GDP every year. It robbed the country of years of human labor and steel or cement that were desperately needed for an actual development elsewhere. In a country that often lacked bread, more and more bunkers were being built. These structures are everywhere. Some have since been turned into tourist attractions, but even today, they still look utterly absurd. In many areas, there were more bunkers than schools or bus stops combined. From a bird's eye view, the landscape is stunning, yet the closer you look, the clearer it becomes that this is a country that spent decades preparing for a war that never came. And that's the crucial point. The bunkers were never meant to protect Albanians from an enemy. Their real purpose was to keep the population in a permanent state of tension and fear, so afraid of an outside enemy that they would never turn against the regime itself. In a state that officially was supposed to be a socialist land of equality, there was a place that contradicted all of that image. A place no ordinary Albanian was even allowed to see. It was called the Bloku, a sealed-off district of the communist elite. It was the heart of luxury hidden in the middle of poverty. The entire center of Tirana was fenced off and removed from public life. Residents were thrown out, and the area was turned into a restricted zone for the chosen elites. Generals, ministers, and the people tasked with keeping the system together. Ordinary citizens were forbidden to enter, and inside, the quality of life was through the roof. The rest of the country couldn't even imagine it. Restaurants with imported meat and wine, bars with Western whiskey, and shops full of products that were unavailable to the wider population. This was a parallel Albania, a state within a state. In the Bloku, there were parked rows of luxury cars imported by a leadership from the West. The very same West that officially wanted to destroy Albania. Elsewhere in the country, people often lived with multiple family members in a single room. But in the Bloku, authorities lived in villas, quietly supplied with Western goods. But the Bloku was not just a bubble of wealth. Also, inside this elite circle of people in power, fear was widespread. Purges could strike anyone, even the closest collaborators. But to keep Albania in total isolation, concrete bunkers alone weren't enough. That's why Hoxha built something far more powerful than the illusion of war. This new, most important tool was the secret police, Sigurimi. Officially, they were to safeguard the state's security, but in practice, they controlled the entire society. In Albania, people truly believed that enemies lurked everywhere, and that the smallest deviation from socialism could mean treason. This was a country where you didn't really have to do anything bad to become a suspect. It was enough that someone thought you seemed a little too self-confident. The most symbolic case was that of Mehmet Shehu, long considered the regime's number 2 man. For 3 decades, he had been a loyal executor of Hoxha's orders, as one of the main architects of the system. And yet he was silenced because of his son's love life with a girl. Officially, it was announced that Shehu had been a spy for the CIA, the KGB, and Yugoslav intelligence all at once. It sounds absurd, and that was exactly the point. The truth didn't matter. The only goal was to destroy Shehu's reputation. And then there were forced labor camps, mines and quarries that made you work 12-hour workdays. Across the country, no one was safe. In Albania, you could be free on Monday and end up in a cell on Tuesday. That is why the system endured so long, because people were afraid to even think differently. Yet, no dictatorship lasts forever. Hoxha's regime began to crack as well, and when Enver Hoxha died in 1985, Albania suddenly plunged into chaos that no one could stop. After 4 decades of rule by a man who controlled everyone in the country, the system faced its greatest test. Albania spent days in state-imposed mourning for the man who had ruled it for 40 years. You'd think it was directed by a filmmaker from Pyongyang. Every sob had to look like a spontaneous outpouring of love for the leader. But the truth was different. People weren't crying from longing, but from fear. In a country where informing on others was an everyday routine, everyone was afraid that if they didn't look sad enough, Sigurimi would come for them. That is the key image of Albania in those times. Even after the dictator's death, people were still afraid of him. For a brief moment, the bare truth was exposed. The entire power of the system did not rest on ideology, but on terror. And precisely because of that, after Hoxha's death, the system began to crumble. It no longer had a leader whom everyone feared. The world outside of Albania's borders was changing faster than anyone expected. And at that point, it was clear that the regime in Albania was deemed to fall. When in 1991, Albania finally started opening up to the world, there was no great explosion of freedom the West had expected. The system didn't fall with a crash. Somehow, it often got even worse. There were no real institutions to replace Hoxha. When fear disappeared, everything else didn't make any sense. People who had heard all their lives that Western countries were poor and corrupt suddenly could see on TV cities in Italy or cars in Germany, colorful shops filled with happy people. It was a cultural shock that in many families broke any remaining trust in the state. And that was only the beginning. A government without experience and control allowed hundreds of so-called investment firms to operate freely. Most of them promised 200 or 300% returns per year if you gave them your money. In a normal country, hardly anyone would fall for that. That's a massive red flag. But Albania was not a normal country. There was no financial education, so many people invested, and ultimately they lost it all. In 1997, there were reports of army depots being looted. Machine guns often ended up in the hands of regular people. The mafia emerged and took control of the ports, while local gangs ruled entire cities. Even today, Albania has one of the highest rates of gun violence in Europe. Over 500,000 Albanians fled to Italy by boat, creating the largest wave of migration in Europe since the collapse of Yugoslavia. Against the backdrop of a stabilizing Poland or Czechia, Albania looked like a country engulfed in civil war. Not because it had been attacked, but because for 40 years it had never been allowed to develop or to build normal institutions. Hoxha had promised that his system would protect Albania from the chaos of the outside world. But in reality, it was his system that plunged Albania into the worst chaos in its history. The fall of communism did not end Albania's problems. In some sense, it merely triggered them. For decades, Hoxha's regime kept people locked in. And when the doors finally opened up, people didn't hesitate, and mass immigration of entire generations began. First fled those who simply felt their life was in danger. Then those who wanted a better life. And finally, those who saw no future in Albania. In the 1990s and 2000s, Albania became one of the fastest depopulating states in Europe. According to UN estimates, over 1/3 of all Albanians now live outside the country. In Italy, Greece, Germany, Switzerland, and even the US. After years of isolation, the state had nothing to offer. There were no stable institutions and no trust in the government. Today, Albania draws in visitors as an affordable holiday paradise. But if you peel away that glossy postcard layer, you see a country whose history is far heavier than the concrete its bunkers are made of. For 40 years, Albania was Europe's North Korea. And it's a really good comparison. Widespread fear sealed the fate of entire families. And when the system collapsed, it turned out it still haunts society. Albania is trying to write a new story now. Authorities are steadily moving closer to Europe and deepening its connections with the West. But the scars of that system are still visible. This lesson shows starkly how quickly authoritarianism can destroy a country so bad that you need more than one generation to build it back up. Many Albanians are now trying to build a better life in Great Britain. Yet, even Britain is increasingly weighed down by its own long-standing and deepening problems. You can learn more about it in the video currently displayed on your screen.